All right, now the sound is also on. Happy Friday. I will try to make kind of like this short type of recap of the week on Friday afternoons. Maybe I will not do it some weeks, but I will try to do something at least to keep in touch. All right, now the sound is also on. To Happy Friday. Kill my own YouTube so I don't hear myself. Yeah, it's always a little bit exciting to start live streaming when you're not super used to it. But I will probably be good at the end of the course and then forget everything until next year again. So 20% of the course has come and gone. Focus has been a lot of domain modeling, which is, well, not surprising and is according to plan also. So let's take a look at the study plan here. Can do like this maybe, or maybe keep me like that. Yeah. So week 36 has now passed. And well, we should be doing domain modeling and maybe start looking into the software architecture parts. But yeah, mainly the domain modeling has been the focus right now. I suspect that next week will also be a lot more questions about domain modeling. So let's try and do our best there. And we actually got a really interesting question. Well, both groups have done this nutritionist or dietist kind of exercise. You find this on the course homepage. So we basically read this description and tried to do a domain model to support these requirements, and we did that one by one, so to speak, so you can get kind of like an idea of how to work. The first step was basically brainstorming a lot of conceptual classes. So we had just added everything that we could think, and we based that often on nouns in this description. And then we start kind of like looking into the requirements one by one, and I think we started with looking at ingredients. All right, we should be able to add, edit, delete, and list ingredients. Ingredients should have a name, a price, a meal type, macronutrients, and kilocalories. So one question we got in the chat was then, should there be, why are there not associations between the user and ingredient with kind of like the names add, edit, delete, and list? Because that's the things that the user can do with the ingredients. And look at our little model here. Well, we have the ingredient class. It has a name, price, kilocalories, and these macronutrients, but no associations to user here really. Well, I think first of all, we kind of like decided that the user was the nutritionist or dietist in Swedish. So that was one clarification that we kind of like discussed our way into when looking at the model. So probably the requirements should be changed to say nutritionist or dietist instead of user all the time, so that we can know who is actually doing this. But again, no associations between the dietist or nutritionist to ingredient, because there is no need to remember that this particular dietist has added or listed or viewed this particular ingredient. So that's one of the key things you can take away, is that just because a user or a type of user can do something does not necessarily mean that we need to remember that this user has done these things. The associations are to remember things over time. For example, we need to know which ingredients are contained in a recipe in some way, because if we have created our nice recipe, we don't want to lose that information. We want to be able to use the recipe in 1 week, in 2 weeks, next year, and so on and so forth. And also maybe the client should be able to look at the recipes and know what ingredients they contain. So that is one thing to think about. Just because you can do something does not mean you necessarily need an association for it. So you need to think about the requirements. If there would have been a requirement that explicitly stated that the nutritionist should be able to list the ingredients he or she has created, and if this is a multi-user system, which we also kind of like agreed that it should be, then we probably would have needed some kind of association between nutritionist and the ingredient to keep track of this relationship over time. So that is one big thing you can take away, that don't just add associations because someone can do something. Otherwise, I think a lot of the interesting modeling in this example revolves around this association class of recipes and ingredients, and we came to the conclusion that we needed to add amounts and a comment and maybe even a unit that for each ingredient in the recipe, and we could not add that in the ingredient, because then every recipe would have the same amount of that ingredient, and that would not be good. And we modeled this in a few different ways, but the association class is maybe the most elegant way to do this. And well, association classes are very powerful, so you should kind of like if you need to add information to the coupling of two classes, then think about using an association class. Yeah, I think another kind of like example we could imagine is well, we had an interesting thing in the Slack channel also about books, for example. So let's see. Oh, not comment, shape. I can copy this one instead. So we had, for example, a book class, and let's say it has a title, and we can imagine a lot of ISBN number and stuff like that, but it's not super interesting. And we had a let's just give generic person, you know, someone that borrows books, and we want to keep track of which books a certain person has borrowed. So this means that we need an association. For example, we might have requirements that says we must list all the outstanding books for a particular person. So a book can be borrowed by several people because, yeah, this month I borrowed the book, next month someone else borrows this book. So let's add multiplicity, and a person can of course borrow several books, right? I will now take a look at the stream thingamajig. Yeah, seems to be working. Cool. However, if we want to know, right now we can kind of like know that, oh, I have borrowed Lord of the Rings and someone else has borrowed Lord of the Rings, but we don't really know what time. All right, did I borrow this yesterday or last year or something like that? So for every kind of like lend we make here, we want to add some information. The period, for example, when I borrowed the book and maybe when I returned the book. So typically we can now use an association class, because when we add something here, let's say borrows, we want to add extra information. So we can then use this association class thing. So let's call this a lend, or I don't know, start date, return date. In this way we can know that I have borrowed Lord of the Rings and I borrowed this in August, so it should be returned by now. Sorry, what happened? So maybe a little bit too intelligent. Something like this. So now we can know what person has borrowed which books at what times. So we can keep track of this over time. And this is typically some kind of history over things. So if that's what we want to model, we can use a construction like this. I think actually the question on Slack was about, all right, we want to, let's say we have a requirement that says that we want to delete the book, but we still want to remember that this person has borrowed this book. Then we cannot delete the book object. We cannot delete Lord of the Rings, and because then this will kind of like disappear. The same thing if we delete the person, we will lose the information about all of the loans of that person. Maybe this is something that we want to have, but if we explicitly don't want to do that, then we cannot simply just delete this. So a simple solution would be to have an attribute is deleted or is available or something like that. Thinking about this even further, I would actually expect that, well, the library probably has several Lord of the Rings items, or exemplar in Swedish, the actual physical book. And maybe we have this copy, I think would be a good English name. This is the actual book that you actually borrow. So that is what you borrow. Copy, and the book actually then well, let's just say describes. So we have a book, description of a book. This is Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. This is the ISBN number and things like that. I don't think we should have this deleted on the book actually. And the book describes the actual copy of the book that you can borrow. And that one can get lost, it can get too worn, so you destroy it and you buy a new one and things like this. So this is the actual copy that I borrow, so to speak. So here we got a nice example actually of a use case for a description class. So the book describes a number of copies of that book, and the copy is what the person actually borrows, and we keep track of this lending of the book by knowing the start date of this and knowing the return date of when I returned the copy, or I did not return the copy. So we can work with our classes like this. Another question was that how can I know that my model is okay? I think primarily you should look at the requirements and try to see that your model supports the requirements. So for example, if we have in our little lending system here, we need to show a list of all the people that has borrowed a particular book. Then the first model would be fine. We would just need an association to the person and the book, because then we can know that I have borrowed Lord of the Rings, the other person can borrow Lord of the Rings, and so on and so forth. However, if the requirement is we need to know when the person borrowed the book, if the book has been returned and things like that, if you have requirements that require this, then it's not sufficient to just have this association. Then we need to know more about when I borrowed the book, so we can find this information. All right, a question about the book description class. Does this mean that there needs to exist at least one copy? Otherwise, the book description class isn't valid anymore. No, I don't think so. I think the book class can definitely exist without any physical copies of it. It would maybe be a little bit strange, but yeah, I think that would be fine. One kind of thinking about things, one might also kind of think about, all right, is it legal to store which person has borrowed certain books and keep that information over time? I doubt that it is actually. So that is also something that you need to look into really. And if a person really wants to be removed from this library, what should happen then? So we have a lot of these kind of like special cases that we need to think about in real life. But yeah, if we just talk about this from a modeling perspective, then I think it's would be fine to have this type of model. All right. Another thing that I have gotten some questions about is that if you should have several domain models or one big domain model for the assignment specifically or in general, you can think about it. So I think if we take a look at this quite weird model now that we added the book thing. Is that, well, these are definitely two separate domains, right? We have one domain that revolves around things that a nutritionist should recognize, right? If we ask a nutritionist to take a look at this, they should, oh yes, we work with body compositions, and we work with ingredients and their nutrient contents, and we plan meals, and we do all of these things. So the domain expert, in this case the nutritionist, will recognize the words here, the classes here, the associations here. And that is also one of the key things that you should try to think about when doing domain modeling. Will the domain expert understand this? If not, well, then you have probably not done it quite right. So if we would just show this, the nutritionist will probably say, oh, I don't, this book thing, that's not part of what I do. So that's a separate domain. You can kind of like apply this also in the assignment. So if there are classes or words that you don't think for example, secretary of the boat club would understand, maybe that is a separate domain. Or is this part of their daily work? Typical examples are that, well, the software engineers, developers tend to want to add software stuff or technical things that are needed for the system to technically work. Those are probably not part of the actual domain, the problem area that you are working with and trying to understand. Another thing that we saw when we did this model was that how many questions we got, because when we do the model, we try to make a neat kind of like order of things, and when the requirements are not always aligned to this kind of like perfect little universe that we want to create. So we can use the model to improve the requirements, and this kind of be simple things, just as aligning the naming of stuff. So user, for example, in these requirements, that was probably not a good word. We should probably say nutritionist here instead. One big thing that we discovered is that should this be a multi-user system or not? So do we need to keep track of the different nutritionists, or don't we have to do it? I mean, could you imagine this just being a piece of software that you install on your computer and you use it? Well, the nutritionist does this on their PC, so to speak, in their office, and then there is no need for this class at all, because the user is the nutritionist. So that's a kind of major thing that we can need to decide quite early, because that would have a huge impact on everything, I think. And some of you probably saw this as, oh, this is a web application. So you took your own experiences and just projected it onto the actual problem here. That's interesting. And yeah, it's also, of course, dangerous to assume that things should be in a certain way. Some of you maybe assume that this would be a nice console application with a nice menu and things like that. But yeah, it's always easy to make assumptions, and the more assumptions you collect, the greater the risk is that something will not be true in your assumptions. So, all right. Also, don't be too stressed about your modeling. I think the working with the model is kind of like the key benefit, really, kind of like thinking about it, trying different approaches. I think that is a key aspect. And this is kind of like creative work also. So give it some time. You need to kind of like get into the mindset and sleep a little bit, let the brain work with it in the background, and I think it will be all right. Cool. take a look at the example that we did. This model is posted on Miro. I think there's a link in the Slack channel to it. Next week, I'm open for suggestions on what we should do. So feel free to post it in Slack. We can do anything on these sessions that we have. Could be more classical tutoring, meeting in small groups, doing things, or we can discuss other things also. Or we can start with software architecture if you want to. How should we think about deadlines? When is the last day to submit the domain model for A1? Are there any strict deadlines, or everything is loose and we should just stick to the study plan? Well, if you look at the study plan, we actually have a deadline for assignment 1, and it's the 23rd. So that is the deadline you should stick to. So and that is a hard deadline. So you create your merge request for that day. I think there's actually also some milestones created in GitLab for this assignment, grade 2 and grade 3. I will need to create the deadlines or milestones for the other grades also. Yeah, speaking about GitLab, you should have your projects now. They should contain a repository. If they don't, contact me and I will try to regenerate that stuff for you ASAP. Yeah, next week, feel free to suggest things. We can start also with software architecture and things like that. Or we can keep at it at the domain modeling. All right, I think live streaming is cool, but half an hour, wow, time flies. I think that's it for today. Don't forget to go voting on Sunday if you have the chance to do that. Please do. And have a super nice weekend, and I will see you all next week. Bye for now.